2014 is being called Afghanistan's time of reckoning. That's when most foreign nations will pull out their combat troops. Of course, some countries, including the U.S., Canada, and Britain, will still be present in a different capacity. They are expected to give the Afghan security forces training and logistical support. So what lies ahead for Afghanistan? Joining us now to discuss that is Shukria Dellawar. Originally from Afghanistan, she is a consultant with the Center for International Policy, a U.S.-based research and advocacy think tank. Also joining us from Long Island is Ted Rall. He's an American author, columnist, and syndicated cartoonist. It's great to have both of you on the broadcast. Ted, I'll get to you in just a bit. I want to start here, though, in the studio. I know you've taken 3 fact-finding missions to Afghanistan in the last 4 years. Look in your crystal ball, give me your sense of what the future looks like for Afghanistan.
Well, right now the future looks really fragile. Afghanistan has yet to sign a security pact with the U.S. It's still being negotiated. There isn't a political settlement in place, and violence has escalated, and there's a 2014 presidential election that the outcome could make or break the country.
Ted, as you look into your crystal ball, how do you see the future for this country?
I agree. The situation is fraught. Currently, the Taliban control most of the rural areas. The central government only hopscotches by air from between the major cities. And as the United States prepares to fully withdraw and hand over complete control to the Karzai regime, it's hard to imagine how much stability is going to last or whether there's going to be a settlement possible. I think at this point, the Taliban are fighting both on the diplomatic front in Qatar as well as at home, and it's probably going to be, as usual, the military situation that prevails, and I would say probably in their favor.
Well, then that leads to the next question. Is the pullout timely or premature? And I'll start with you.
I think it's neither timely nor premature. At this point, it's just a face-saving exit strategy. I don't think the focus is on peace. It hasn't been on peace. If the focus had been on peace, we would have started negotiations with Taliban in 2002 when we had pretty much put them in their corners. But we had several points during the last decade that we could have really focused on peace, but we kept focusing militarily, and the 11th hour pretty much has passed.
So, Ted, do you see it that way too? A lot of missed opportunities?
I think this project was doomed from day one. The United States never should have invaded Afghanistan.
I want to get your thoughts on that.
I don't agree with the never invading, but the Taliban had to go, and Afghans were being repressed, and terrorism had to be taken out from Afghanistan and the region. But how we went in and who we empowered is an entirely different story. We put a lot of the warlords of the 90s back in power, and because of those moves, we have not been able to stabilize the country.
Ted, back then, though, it was a different time. I mean, it was right after the 9/11 attacks. I think pretty much not only the United States was behind President Bush's move to invade Afghanistan, but I think the Western world, I mean, we saw the support from England as well. I mean, if you had said this maybe a day before the invasion, people would have said this is blasphemy. But you feel strongly this way.
Well, I did say it before the invasion, and you're right. That's exactly what they said. You know, there's a tendency to look back and say, well, you know, the invasion was a good idea, but the execution, the installation of Karzai, the marginalization of the Taliban, those were errors in judgment. I would argue, and in fact I predicted at the time, that that was exactly what the United States would do. History shows that the United States doesn't have the cultural sensitivity or the political acumen to manage any kind of foreign occupation, really pretty much ever since the end of World War II. They made the same mistakes in Vietnam and during the Gulf conflict and in a lot of other cases. So it wasn't hard to see any of this coming. There was really never any chance that the United States, least of all under George W. Bush, was going to be able to pull this off any differently or not install a puppet like Karzai who wasn't popular, or marginalize the powers that they drove out, the Taliban who they drove out of power. I mean, this was all predictable at the time, and many of us who were observing at the time were wondering if 9/11 was to be dealt with as a military matter, which I think should have been discussed and debated, it never was, Pakistan might have been a more logical place to go. I mean, after all, as they say, if you invade Pakistan, you get Afghanistan for free.
Shukria, I want to get your thoughts on that.
I agree with some of what he's saying, but not all. I don't believe that either country, if you're going to look at, if you have the position that the invasion doesn't help, then you have to go through it through intelligence, which is something we never considered after 9/11. We went in with heavy military, and we are still droning Afghanistan and Pakistan 12 years later, and the insurgency is stronger than ever. So,
you know, Ted, you brought up former President George W. Bush, and of course, one of the things that he touted was bringing democracy to Afghanistan, bringing democracy to Iraq, and it made me think of the late Philip Slater and what he wrote about democracy. Now, I want to get your thoughts. I want to get both of you to respond to this. He said, everyone talks about democracy, but few people have any idea why it exists, why it is happening now, or where it will lead. Where will it lead in Afghanistan, Ted?
Well, you know, you could argue, to be wry about it, that Afghanistan has more democracy than anyone, because due to the corruption, they had 100% or more voter turnout. So I don't know how much more democracy anyone could want. I mean, this was a country that had no law and order at the time, and still pretty much doesn't in most of it. Security is the main problem. We're talking about a country that didn't have street names or house numbers or a postal system or a centralized monetary system or a phone in 2001. And yet George W. Bush wanted to come in and install a democracy. Well, they didn't really much try, did they? I mean, the first Loya Jirga was essentially completely fixed from behind the scenes in order to exclude the exiled king who had returned at the request of the Afghan people. The Afghans never really got a chance to even have a representation, much less a democracy. And so I think there was no effort to install a democracy, and that's just as well because democracy was never possible. But here we are 13 years later with the rather embarrassing, 12 years later, with the rather embarrassing situation where the United States has essentially installed the same president over that entire time, one who's not even popular with the majority of the Afghan people.
Let me get Shukria to jump in here. I want to give her a chance.
Well, first of all, I mean, you can't install democracy. Democracies can't be installed. The trouble is that's the thinking United States has had all along. If it had worked with the right Afghans, not the warlords, then gotten their perspectives and implemented that for Afghanistan, democracy would have taken root. That is what Afghans want. But you cannot force it militarily and make all the logistical errors that it has in the last 12 years.
Well, I think what I'm hearing from both of you, and I think both of you will agree with this, is that the U.S. really had very little understanding of what was happening on the ground.
The U.S. went in not understanding Afghan culture, the Afghan political sphere. It talked to the few people that agreed to go after the Taliban and handed the country pretty much to them, and missed every chance at peace. And this is why we are where we are today.
So that leads to the next question, Ted. What's going to happen with Doha? Is there really any hope there, these talks?
I think no. You know, if there's the opportunity is really from the standpoint of the Taliban, this is definitely a win for them. This is essentially a surrender by the United States. You know, I agree that the withdrawal is a saving move. The United States is withdrawing because they have lost. They have never been able to close the deal, and they've never been able to win on the ground. They haven't won militarily, they haven't won hearts and minds, and they never really tried very hard, and they never really stood much of a chance. I think the Doha process is going to be of interest as an opportunity for the West to get to know the people who most likely will end up running Afghanistan. That would probably be a good idea.
I think the Doha Qatar office, really, it depends on where India and Pakistan can agree on things. Taliban is not going to be fully able to take over. We have armed Afghans to the teeth in the last 12 years. And there's a lot of opposing forces in Afghanistan to Taliban. And so that doesn't mean that when U.S. pulls out, the whole country is absolutely going to fall to the Taliban. Yes, they will definitely come back in, but it's going to end up in civil war if there's no peace settlement. But there is still a chance if India and Pakistan can work together on Afghanistan. They have they have shared borders, and they can prevent this colossal mistake that history will just regret, both Pakistani history and both Indian. And China then can play a very good role. It has really close relations with Pakistan. It can play an influential role to bring the Taliban to negotiate with the Afghans directly, and that's something U.S. can still do. But again, it's really the last minute. Will these powers do this, or will they not? Will they abandon the Afghans one more time?
Well, we'll have both of you back on, hopefully with positive answers down the road a piece. Ted, thanks so much for joining us. Shukria, thank you for stopping by and talking about this as well. Very important topic.
Thank you.